Chapter 1. I was at the video shop with my 12-year-old son when he rented Kikujiro, a tough guy / little boy Japanese film whose charming, twitching hoodlum is played by an actor named Beat Takeshi. How could I have known where this would lead? Over the next few weeks, Charlie rented Kikujiro a number of times, and although I was with him when he did so, I had no idea how powerfully he'd been affected, not until he said, quietly, en passant, "When I grow up, I'm going to live in Tokyo." Charlie's a shy boy, and later I wondered if he had glimpsed a country where his own character might be seen as admirable. Whether this was true or not, his silent passion for Japan soon broadened, inflamed not only by Kikujiro but a whole range of other stimuli. I don't mean that he lay in bed at night reading Tanizaki or Basho. That would finally be my fate. He was 12 years old. It was the year before Iraq, before he discovered punk rock, NoFX, and Anti-Flag. He and his friends skateboarded, they had Xboxes and GameCubes and PlayStation 2s, and although he read for half an hour at night, he set the timer for exactly 30 minutes and closed the book the instant that it rang. What he then picked up were English translations of Japanese comic books. These came from stories inhabited by pimply youths sporting green hair and staples in their heads. Forbidden Planet is on Lower Broadway, walking distance from our house, and I would accompany him there on Saturday mornings. Although I knew that Japanese comics were called manga, I would still have said that a comic was a comic, no matter what you named it. At Forbidden Planet, I slowly began to understand that I was wrong. The first and most obvious difference in Japanese comics is the broadness of subject matter, from saccharine stories featuring little big-eyed girls to the dense, serious works of Osamu Tezuka. Although this is not something one discovers in a single Saturday morning. What was immediately obvious was the startlingly graphic nature of manga, which, in its clarity of line and dramatic, blocky forms, echoed the Japanese woodblock prints of the 19th century. Charlie and I were soon drifting uptown, where, around Grand Central, we found places where the entire English language had been vaporized. Here, in stories catering to Japanese exiles, the graphic nature of manga was more dramatically apparent. Gone were the wordier English translations. Instead, we saw bold hieroglyphics, stamped with 2 or 3 characters that could be read, although not by us, as unthinkingly as a traffic light. Charlie soon became interested in a comic book series called Akira, although a comic book is a skinny little thing, whereas a manga has an altogether different heft. Akira would finally run to 6 volumes with 1-inch spines. I remember how we walked for mile after weary mile in search of a store where the punk-faced slackers might have finally unpacked what we both knew was in their basement: freshly delivered cartons of Akira No. 6. Sometimes I was the censor, but more often was delighted by artists I would never have discovered if not for my preternaturally tall, crew-cut son. While I never read Akira as attentively as he did, I looked closely enough to understand that it dealt with motorcycle gangs in Neo-Tokyo many years after an atomic devastation. Akira was the name of an immense, malevolent, apocalyptic device, or person, or both actually, that still lay dormant at the center of the city. On Akira's graphic pages I found images so artful that I could imagine hanging them on my wall. Akira, born as manga, had also been made into an animated film, which, being Japanese, is not called a cartoon, but an anime. It's easy to see why this form should deserve its own label, although less easy to explain why the name is French. Certainly it differs from American animation, which has usually been, with some spectacular expectations, a dumbed-down form. In America, cartoons are thought to be kids. In Japan, anime is as much respected as live-action films, and not at all limited to a specific age group. The first anime I saw was based on Akira, and I was immediately struck by the artistry of the frames, their combination of realism, exaggeration, something ineffably and inarguably Japanese. Once I got hold of a subtitled version and was therefore able to escape the cute Hollywood dubbing, I was at home in a strange, intriguing land. I was as hooked as Charlie. I wanted more. Of course, some anime are original, some are shallow, and many are downright silly, but even the really silly ones soon began to seem like artifacts worthy of cultural investigation. For instance, a Japanese clog is called a geta, and usually sports 2 of those devices, which I can only call a heel, one at the place its name would lead you to expect, the other at the toe. Why then was that warrior in the anime wearing a clog with just one crazy little stilt, neither at the heel nor the toe, but at the balance point of the clog? This must mean something, even in a silly doodle. I found reference to the strange clog in Bashur. It didn't solve the mystery, but I began to develop the first of my many misunderstandings, imagining that Bashur's ascetic rural Buddhists wore these clogs because it made walking more difficult. So as my son read manga and I glued myself to anime, I began to wonder if we might enter the mansion of Japanese culture through its garish, brightly lit back door. Later I solved the heel puzzle when we talked to a venerable clog maker in Tokyo. "Ah," he said, "you mean a one-tooth." He then explained that a one-tooth was easier and safer to use in uneven mountain terrain. It was easier, not harder to walk on. In any case, I began encouraging Charlie to puzzle at the information hidden within manga and anime, and particularly to wonder about what all those foreign characters were doing there. I already knew that the Japanese word gaijin, politely translated as foreigner, literally meant barbarian. So what did those plentiful foreign characters sound like to a Japanese ear? What sort of accents might these barbarians have? What might their voices signify? Each night Charlie had his 30 minutes of reading literature, but when the timer rang, he instantly put down To Kill a Mockingbird and picked up Akira. By the time he was into Akira number 6, I was reading William Hines' With Perry to Japan. Commodore Perry, of course, the most famous gaijin of them all, the American who opened up Japan to trade in 1854. I interrupted my son's readings to show him the illustrations in my book, 19th century Japanese woodcuts of Perry's big-nosed foreign face. I did not tell him that this nose, in Japanese, meant the gaijin had a very large penis. My point was that these illustrations, given their line, their exaggeration, would have been right at home in manga. In other words, the high and the low, the historic and the modern, were built on the banks of the same river. As we continued to find these connections, it was only natural that we were soon chatting about the impact of foreigners on Japan, from Perry to MacArthur, not excluding Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Charlie brought home the famous manga about Hiroshima, Barefoot Gen. Not to be outdone, I unearthed Studio Ghibli's masterly anime about the firebombing of Tokyo, Grave of the Fireflies. If this was pop culture, it was also art and history, and our conversations took an interesting swerve. Coming back from Brooklyn after school one day, my son wondered if I thought the A-bombs would have been dropped had Commodore Perry just stayed at home. Who knows? Maybe not. In that case, Charlie concluded, there would be no Godzilla. He wasn't being heartless or trivial. Godzilla had always been a self-conscious Japanese response to the horror of Hiroshima. The monster was the bomb. The kid who would never talk in class was now brimming with new ideas he wasn't shy to discuss. I was excited by him and for him, and for myself too, because I had already visited Japan twice, and now realized I had a perfect pedagogic rationale for indulging my interests further. "Would you like to go to Japan?" I asked. "If you like," he said, so dryly I couldn't believe it. "I thought you'd be excited." His lips flickered, and he lowered his eyes. "Not if I have to see the real Japan." This has alluded to a story I thought he had long forgotten about an earlier trip I made to Tokyo with my friend Fremantle Jack. While neither of us had been to Japan before, if one of us was going to drive, it definitely should not have been Fremantle Jack, a fine poet, but the jitteriest Buddhist I have ever met. As for me, I could recognize only a handful of Japanese characters, and my sense of direction was terrible. I should never have been the navigator. But as we approached the city, I was the one who shouted the directions, and Jack who jerked the wheel in response, and that was how, miraculously, we found ourselves on the road to Ginza. I was elated by this serendipity, but Fremantle Jack was tugging at his earlobe, not a good sign if you knew him well. "What's the matter, mate?" "What's the matter?" he cried. "Are you bloody blind? Look at it!" The Ikebukuro-sen, the number 5 expressway, was a concrete ribbon, winding very beautifully, I thought, above the flat roofs of Tokyo, which was like nothing I had ever seen, low and chalky, white and almost treeless, distinguished by water towers on every building. Even before I got down into the little lanes of Shinjuku, before I walked amongst the perfect Japanese Elvises in Harajuku, before I met Hisao the left-handed, who made the most extraordinary chisels on the planet, it was here, on the Ikebukuro-sen, that I decided to write a science fiction screenplay just so we could shoot it in Tokyo. "It's so American," said Jack. "I didn't come all the way for this." "Well, what do you want?" "I want to see the real Japan." I knew what he meant, of course. Temples, tea ceremony, kabuki. But I teased him for it, and was doubtless a very irritating companion for the next 2 weeks. "No real Japan," said Charlie. "You've got to promise no temples, no museums." "What would we do?" "We could buy cool manga." "There'll be no English translations." "I don't care. I'd eat raw fish." "What else?" "And slimy things. I'd eat everything." "What if we interviewed some anime directors?" I asked, trying to figure out how to pay the airfares. "Could we talk to Tomino?" "Who's he?" "Only the director of Mobile Suit Gundam." "We could talk to people about what all the weird stuff really means." "Could we meet the guy who did Godzilla?" "Maybe. I don't know." As the weeks passed, the fantasy hardened into a plan, and Charlie spent a lot of time eating raw fish and revising the lists of anime directors and manga artists he required me to interview. "Maybe," I suggested, "you can ask them questions too." "Maybe," he said doubtfully. "Can I have an ice cream?" I was not without contacts in Japan. I wrote first to Paul Hulbert, who was then working for my Tokyo agents. Given their distinguished lists of literary authors, I expected he would have little knowledge of cartoons and comic books, so I told him what Mobile Gundam was, and why I was interested in such a lowly project. "Perhaps," he replied, "I should explain a little about myself." Yes, he was a literary agent, of course, but he had previously worked at Kodansha, a large Japanese publishing house that produced many best-selling manga, including most of the Mobile Suit Gundam series. During my time there, I worked with manga and anime creators, and in my final year was involved in the production of an 825-page authorized encyclopedia of the Gundam saga called Gundam Officials. So I began to understand that the fringe cult in New York City was a huge business in Japan, where 1.9 billion manga were sold in 1995, a staggering 40% of all magazine sales. Everybody in Japan read manga, except those just born or about to die. Paul said he would certainly arrange an interview with Mr. Tomino, the originator of the Gundam series. "Could I have my photograph taken with him?" Charlie asked. "Sure." He bought a map of Tokyo and marked weird things with purple stars and cool things with silver circles. His teachers were impressed and hoped he might give a talk on his return. However, while this new obsession seemed to have briefly transformed him into someone almost garrulous, he had not really changed his character. So when we finally took off from JFK on the first day of his summer vacation, there were important words he had not yet spoken. Only as we landed in Narita did he confess that he'd made a Japanese friend on the internet, and this friend would soon come to visit us at the hotel. "How can he find our hotel?" "Dad, it's on the itinerary. I attached it as a Windows document." Getting more information was like drawing teeth. The friend's name was Takashi. He apparently had no other name. He wanted to practice his English. Yes, he was interested in anime. Was that all right? "How old is Takashi?" "Obviously he's a kid." "Is he a teenager?" "A kid, that's all I know." I would watch this damn Takashi like a hawk. If he showed the slightest hint of creepiness, he was gone. Arriving by train in Tokyo, I lost the Japanese language map specifically drawn to get us from the station to our hotel. "Don't worry," I said. "It'll be fine." Later, Charlie said, "You didn't think it would be fine at all. You did that thing with your hand, like when you're really stressed out." "What thing?" "That thing. You know." Naturally, the taxi driver had no English, and yet when he saw our crumpled English map, he didn't sneer like the Manhattan cabbie. He studied it. once at the start of the journey, and then 3 more times en route. We were on our way to ryokan, a traditional inn with tatami floors, beds that were rolled away each morning, and a little tokonoma, the alcove in which the artful Japanese will display a single precious object. One might assume Tokyo was full of these hotels, but this one, which was also moderately priced, had been very hard to track down, and now seemed impossible to find. The best our driver could do was deposit us at the wrong end of a one-way lane and point with his Mickey Mouse white gloves. Looking down the lane, I could see mostly parked bicycles and garbage cans, a foreign country where I could not read or speak the simplest phrase. Understanding my hesitation, the driver personally escorted us, running ahead and waving for us to follow, the idling engine of his unlocked cab inviting auto theft. Touched by his kindness and his poor man's shoes, I shook his gloved hand. He, in turn, shook hands with Charlie. "Goodbye," he said. He bowed, then jogged back to his taxi. The inn is located in the Asakusa district, which was bombed to dust in World War II. In the 19th century, when Tokyo was named Edo, Asakusa was a stop on the route from the city to Yoshiwara, the so-called pleasure quarters celebrated in kabuki and woodblock prints. Soon, Asakusa became a pleasure quarter of its own, offering prostitution, kabuki, and such peculiarly risque entertainments as female sword fighting. In the streets of Asakusa, we recognized the big temple bell from Kikujiro, and saw our first transvestite, questionable geisha, pachinko parlor, strip joint, our first drunks sleeping in cardboard boxes. Inside the ryokan was another world entirely. Old Japan, kimonos, fish and rice for breakfast. "Ask if there's a message," Charlie said. "From who?" "Takashi." But we were already being escorted to a phone box, which turned out to be an elevator, and while we ascended mechanically, the kimonoed maid tore up the stairs, spiraling around us so she might meet us when the lift doors opened on the floor above. "Watch head," she said, a little out of breath. The low-ceilinged corridor presented many reasons to watch head. As we turned left, then right, past the communal bath and into our room, which, if spacious in comparison with the lift, was very small indeed. A single bed had been made up on the floor. "Ah," said the maid, seeing my unhappy face. "So sorry. We thought one person only." I had sent so many faxes asking for a big room that I am almost certain, and of course I may be wrong, that this was as large a room as 2 people were going to be allowed. Any bigger and they would have squeezed in 3 mattresses. Back in the days of travelling salesmen, this is how hotels accommodated them, and you see the economic sense of it. Now that there are no travelling salesmen, the hotel stages cultural performances, traditional songs, little plays, big parties, 50 empty beer bottles after breakfast. "One more mattress, yes?" "Yes." "Where do we put our suitcases?" "Ah, so sorry. Japanese room." Yes, that's exactly what the faxes had demanded. A Japanese room, tatami, very minimal. We'd seen it in the movies. Now we resolved to keep it neat. Except there was nowhere to hide the luggage. Never mind. I never saw a suitcase in the movies. We had no sooner begun to drink our green tea, sitting cross-legged at the little table that would be pushed to one side at night, than Charlie asked me to call Takashi. The first salvo in what would become a constant battle to have me talk instead of him. "You call," I said. "He's your friend." "Dad, I have to go to the toilet." As he closed the door behind him, I resolved that I would not give in this time. He would have to talk himself. "Come," he called from the bathroom. "Come now, quick!" Whatever he had seen in the bathroom, I knew immediately it was very strange. He'd already seen weird Japanese stuff on the way here. The white-gloved taxi driver, the extraordinary neon-lit shop of pink and orange and blue flowers, a newsstand filled with countless manga with spines 2 inches thick. But the strangeness he was now negotiating was of a different magnitude. "Everybody with a taste for traditional architecture," Junichiro Tanizaki wrote in 1933, "must agree that the Japanese toilet is perfection. He then lamented the cost of traditional construction and described his own compromise between cost and custom. I at least avoided tiles. I had the floor done in camphor. To that extent, I tried to create a Japanese atmosphere, but was frustrated, finally, by the toilet fixtures themselves. As everyone knows, toilet fixtures are made of pure white porcelain and have handles of sparkling metal. Were I able to have things my own way, I would much prefer fixtures, both men's and women's, made of wood. Wood finished in glistening black lacquer is the very best. But even unfinished wood, as it darkens and the grain grows more subtle with the years, acquires an inexplicable power to calm and soothe. The ultimate, of course, is a wooden morning glory, urinal filled with boughs of cedar. This is a delight to look at, and makes not the slightest sound. "Dad, come now! Look!" God knows what Tanizaki would have thought, but I was certainly as startled as my son, for the toilet in our traditional hotel looked like a contraption designed for a science fiction comedy. Its arrays of yellow, red, and blue buttons beside the seat might, as one could guess, lower or raise the device, convert the toilet into a bidet, or, surely this must have been my misunderstanding, a shower. However, it was not immediately clear how one would flush it. Finally, I pushed the blue button, and the toilet indeed flushed. But then water started gushing from a faucet into a triangular basin in the corner of the room. We burst out laughing. It was at just this moment, before we had time to discover that the seat was electrically heated, that the telephone rang. "Please come," a woman said. "Who is this?" "Front desk. You come now, please." "That'll be Takashi," said my son, slipping into his shoes in the vestibule. "Is there a problem?" I asked the woman on the phone. "Yes, please come now." Charlie was convinced it was Takashi, though I was equally certain there was a problem with my MasterCard. We bickered amiably while proceeding down the narrow stairs. In the tiled reception, the two young women who'd welcomed us so warmly were still smiling, though differently now, with a sort of grimace of embarrassment. Credit card, I thought. Credit card for sure. The elder, she was no more than 30, did not speak. Instead, she made a gesture that foreigners are taught is more polite than pointing. Not one finger, but all 5 digits together, like a slap. Looking in the direction this indicated, I saw, by the wide doorway to the lane, in front of the antique calligraphic banner, and beside the picturesque sake barrels, the most singular boy. It was not just his hair, or his eyes, or his clothes that distinguished him. There was a certain quality of light that he seemed to have brought in with him, one quite distinct from the deep shadows and glowing gold tones of the ryokan. Something more like that clean, white, almost hallucinogenic illumination in a Tokyo department store. He literally shone. I looked at Charlie. How happy he seemed. This must be Takashi. I did not doubt it. In Tokyo's Harajuku district, one can see those perfect Japanese Michael Jacksons, no hair out of place, and punk rockers whose punkness is detailed so fastidiously that they have achieved a polished hyper-reality. Takashi had something of this quality. He had black hair that stood up not so much in spikes but in dramatic triangular sections. His eyes were large and round, glistening with an emotion that, while seemingly transparent, was totally alien to me. He wore a high-necked Cambridge blue jacket with what might have once been called a Mao collar, and which glistened with gold buttons. His trousers were jet black, his boots knee-high. No one could doubt his pride or his sense of dignity. "Charlie-san?" he asked, and bowed. My son also bowed. The women in kimonos looked straight ahead as if none of this was happening. Perhaps we can take tea?" I suggested. I had earlier noted a little salon just beside the reception. Here, I assumed, such meetings might be held, but there was something about Takashi that, so sorry, made this salon temporarily unavailable. The 3 of us were ushered back up to our room, and tea was brought up to us in this fine and private place. When the maid left us, Takashi said, You have cable here, Charlie-san? They turned together to evaluate the very small television set beside our 2 suitcases. I guess so, Charlie said. We've just got here. I invited Takashi to inspect the television. Very nice, he said, even though there were only 3 channels and we were reduced to watching a demonstration of a device sucking wax from a man's ear. There was a close-up of brown material in a bowl. Very clever, said Takashi. You have a very nice hotel. Old style. Difficult to keep neat, I said. We have nowhere to put the suitcases. Yes, he said. Everyone owns many things. In the old days, the rich families, they would have a storehouse for their stuffu. Stuffu? Stuffu, he said again, then turned to Charlie. You know, stuffu. Stuff, Dad, Charlie said. Worldly goods. The merchants got so rich, but it was against the law for them to be higher than samurai. Still, they have lots of stuffu. Dangerous for them to show off, I think. Cut their head off if they get too high. So nice they build a simple house. Looks simple, but very expensive to make. And they show just one expensive thing at a time, here, in the tokonoma. This was the only time I heard this intriguing suggestion, that the origins of the tokonoma lay in the old sumptuary laws. These days, everyone has stuffu. I show you. He produced from deep inside his coat a little photographic book called Tokyo, A Certain Style, whose hundreds of untidy teenage rooms turned out to be the apartments of Tokyo designers, musicians, software inventors, swatch collectors, publicists, editors, no one of them displaying anything like what you would call a Japanese aesthetic. They looked more like Charlie's bedroom in Manhattan, and my son fell hungrily upon the thick square volume, identifying everything, item by item, brand name by brand name, Xbox, GameCube, Game Boy, stuffy. Dad, he said, this is so cool. There are things here I never saw before. Very Japanese, said Takashi. This is what I said I would show you and your father, Charlie said. This week you will see the real Japan. You saw pictures of temples? He asked me. 1 or 2, I admitted. Yes, rocks, gravel, nice Japanese room, so simple. Houses with rough timber? Yes, I said, very beautiful. Real Japanese people not like that, Takashi smiled. I made my polite open palm gesture towards the atomic toilet. I understand, I said. More modern. Takashi got up and peered into the bathroom. No, this is American. But we don't have these toilets in the United States. Perhaps you are from Australia? Soon you will go to Macy's in New York. You will see. In any case, I will show you these toilets here, in Akihabara, Electric Town. But now you are tired. We can meet at Akihabara. Where is that? Everyone will know it. Akihabara, on the JR line. At the station, go to exit 3. He then produced a small gift-wrapped box and handed it to Charlie. Something you use in Tokyo, he said. You find me anywhere. We all stood bowing in the little room. He stepped off the tatami and somehow managed to slip into his tall boots as easily if they were a pair of slippers. Only when he'd left did we discover what his gift was. A wafer-thin, iridescent orange object, which, when opened, revealed itself to be a phone, with a skittishly active little screen. My first thought that this was far too expensive, but Takashi's carefully handwritten note explained that he was simply lending it to us for our visit. You see this, Dad? Charlie was holding up a little string of luminous beads attached to the bottom of the phone. You know what this is for? No. It stops cancer. Charlie! Dad, you don't know. It deflects the microwaves from the phone. Oh, I see. What else does it do? Sends texts. In Japanese? In English? If you want to send in Japanese, it's harder. How do you know this? But he was already busy with his thumbs. Okay, that's enough. We're going out to eat. Can I take the cell? No. Please? No, you'll fiddle all through dinner. Can I leave it in the tokonoma? Yes. Now let's go. Now let's go.